مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. عام 2021 كان عام التغيير من الناحية التاريخية، فقد شهد تحولا من عصر دونالد ترامب، عصر التقلب وعدم اليقين والانقسام، إلى عصر جو بايدن، عصر العودة إلى قيادة سياسية أمريكية أكثر تقليدية. رحب بعض الأمريكيين بهذا التغيير. أمريكيون آخرون أرادوا هذا التغيير، لكن وصول بايدن للرئاسة كان بالتأكيد عودة إلى شكل من قيادة هو أكثر تقليدية. في الوقت نفسه قسم عام 2021 نفسه إلى القسمين. في الأشهر الثمانية الأولى أظهرت إدارة بايدن الجدارة والكفاءة. بدأت الحكومة تعمل بشكل جيد، لكن في الأشهر القليلة الماضية بدءا من الفوضى في أفغانستان انعدمت الثقة بإدارة بايدن، والنتيجة هي أن الرئيس أنهى عام 2021 حيث انخفضت القبول الشعبي خلال أدائه ليسبق تقريبا كما كان في عهد دونالد ترامب. لمناقشة السنة التي بدأت بالانتفاضة وانتهت بمخاوف جديدة من حدوث جائحة، يسعدني أن أرحب باثنين من مراقبين السياسيين ذوي البصيرة، إلين غودفري ونورمان أورنستين. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. What a year of contrast. What a year of change. 2021. Let's take a look back at how we got where we are today. It's not often that we get Norm Ornstein joining with Elaine Godfrey to talk about the year that passed. I'm delighted to welcome you both. And it's not often that we have perhaps the most consequential event of 2021 in its very first week. So Norm, the insurrection, remind us what happened first in the 2 months that followed the presidential election in November that led up to the events of January 6th.
Sure, Rob. And of course, the first thing to keep in mind is the American political system is so different from most others, like a parliamentary system where you have an election and then immediately you have a transfer in power. Our election comes on the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November of 1 year. And then we have a transition that lasts all the way until January 20th of the next year. But during that interim period, many things happen, including because we have an electoral college. It's not just the votes that people cast, but elections by state. And there are particular individuals called electors who meet on a date that is defined in law, and they cast those votes. Before they meet, the states have to certify who the winner is of the electoral votes of the states. And then on January 3rd, the new Congress convenes, the one that was elected in November. And on January 6th, they formally ratify the winner of the presidential election. Usually that's a pretty pro forma session. Every once in a while, there's a controversy about a state. Of course, we could go back to the year 2000 with Al Gore and George W. Bush, where we didn't have a result really until the Supreme Court acted right before that January 6th date. But this time it was different because Donald Trump refused to accept the results of the election and took January 6th as a date in which he could overturn those results, relying on his vice president. The vice president presides over a session of the House and Senate meeting together to decide whether the electors have cast lawful votes. And that did not happen. A large crowd gathered. Donald Trump urged them to go to the Capitol. They breached the Capitol, overwhelmed the police with violence, a number of people killed, and members of Congress thinking that they might themselves be killed before it was finally quelled. And later in the day, they met and ratified Joe Biden is president, inaugurated on January 20th. But of course, the reverberations from that day continue to the present.
So thank you, Norm. Elaine, let's take a closer look at January 6th, through the men and women who lived through it, through the experience that perhaps you have covering it. What happened? What did it mean?
Well, I was there that day, was not expecting what happened to happen. It had started out that day as just a rally to encourage Vice President Mike Pence to not certify Biden's win. And Trump spoke at it. A number of Trump family members and officials spoke. And then there was this sort of mass march to the Capitol, and I followed along. I was interviewing people along the way. We got there to the Capitol. It was about the full length of the mall. It's a long walk, 30 minutes or so. We walked to the end. By the time we'd gotten there, people were already climbing the scaffolding outside the Capitol building that was erected for the inauguration. People were breaking windows in the back and sort of wrestling with police officers. All of the barrier fences had been, smashed down into the mud. It was extremely frightening and just unreal to watch. I know that not everyone who was there was, clearly it was unexpected for a lot of the people who were there as well. I was interviewing some Trump supporters who said, okay, we're going to go home now. This is crazy. And they left. But I also interviewed others who said, let's go inside. And they got pepper sprayed, and I was pepper sprayed. And it was just a very intense experience. And for the lawmakers inside who weren't sure what was going on, they were hiding in, I think, the Ways and Means Committee meeting room. It was just very traumatic. What did it mean? I think it meant that the Capitol was much more vulnerable than we ever thought. It meant that, wow, people are angry enough and perhaps have been convinced by Trump's allies, that this election was stolen. They really thought that. They thought it enough to break into the Capitol building. And I think that was shocking to me and to most other people covering it and watching from home.
So the events of that day had two consequences, at least. One, as you said, Norm, later that day, Joe Biden was confirmed, that his election was ratified. Lawmakers came together to make that firm declaration. And he was inaugurated 2 weeks later. And Trump was impeached for the second time. A president went through impeachment. Let's talk about those two events: inauguration as a moment of change, and impeachment as the last, at least in that time period, the last episode of the Trump administration. Norm?
Sure, but I want to take us back to one element of January 6th, which is the Capitol was trashed. Members of Congress fled. They came back later that day, and many of them believing that their lives had been under threat. But when they voted, 2/3 of the Republicans in the House voted that the election had been stolen, that in fact Donald Trump was the victor. So there are reverberations from this that continue, and we'll get to some of those, including a public in which 60 to 70% of Republicans still believe that Donald Trump actually won the election. But the inauguration itself was an unusual one in this sense. It was done in the typical fashion. It was done at the Capitol outside, and with a crowd, a smaller crowd than usual, of course, because of the pandemic. But in previous inaugurations, the outgoing president and vice president come to the inaugural ceremonies. It's a hallmark of the peaceful transfer of power that has been what the United States stands for. Donald Trump boycotted, did not come. So that was itself a signal of something rather disturbing. But then we got an impeachment based on incitement to insurrection. And it passed the House with a small number of Republicans voting for it. It's a majority in the House. It takes 2/3 of the Senate to convict in a trial for impeachment. There were Republicans who voted for at least one article of impeachment. Before the trial took place, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, condemned Donald Trump, said that he was culpable and responsible for all of this, but then would not vote to convict him. And one of the excuses given was impeachment is supposed to be about removing somebody from office who has committed high crimes and misdemeanors. He was already out of office. But of course, the reality is that impeachment can take place at any time. And it means usually if it happens, that you're barred from pursuing that office or holding that office in the future. So there were reasons to do it. It was a powerful demonstration of wrongdoing by a president, but his own party rallied behind him, and so he was not convicted the second time, of course, that he had been impeached.
All right. We've only gotten through the month of January. We have 11 months to go. We're going to come back in just a minute with a lightning round to look at events in 2021 with our guests. Stay still. We'll be right back. If you are addicted to American politics, there are a lot of great new books out there for you to read. Many of them are autobiographies, the sort of book a politician writes either before they mount a challenge for higher office or toward the end of a storied career. Depending on political leanings, there are volumes on the left, from Stacey Abrams, Adam Schiff, and Elizabeth Warren, to name a few, and on the right, from people like Newt Gingrich, Tucker Carlson, and Josh Hawley. I lean toward the works of great historians who can differentiate between what seems urgent today and what will be important when we look back over time. Looking at this year's crop of books, here's 3 for your holiday shopping list. The Red and the Blue by Steve Kornacki, a look at the rivalry between Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich that gave birth to today's slash and burn, winner-take-all partisanship. Leadership in Turbulent Times, a close-up view of what made Abraham Lincoln, the 2 Roosevelts, and LBJ among the most consequential of our leaders, by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And Travels with George, In Search of Washington and His Legacy, by the dogged Revolutionary War historian Nathaniel Philbrick. Look back to look forward. That's my motto. Joining us today is Elaine Godfrey. Elaine is politics reporter for The Atlantic, one of America's leading magazines of news and ideas. A native of Iowa, in the middle of America, she has also written for Real Clear Politics and New York Magazine. Also joining us is Norman Ornstein. Norm is Emeritus Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and one of America's wisest experts on politics, Congress, and the presidency. A native of the state of Minnesota, also in the middle of America, he is a contributing editor and columnist for National Journal and The Atlantic, and an election analyst for BBC News. All right, we need to move through 11 months of the year in just around 8 minutes. Year in which we moved from focus on virus to a focus on vaccine. Elaine, tell us a little bit about the politics of vaccines in 2021.
Yeah, so I would say Biden started off his presidency pretty strong by really kicking vaccine production into gear, launching a national campaign to get people vaccinated. And I think that the first half of 2021, that went really well, actually. I mean, there were questions about, can you make people get the vaccine? Can you, who will get it? But I think that there was this crush initially of people wanting to get vaccinated. And it went really well. I think that sort of changed once all of the people who had really wanted to get vaccinated and were eligible to get vaccinated, once those people sort of ran out, then the Biden administration ran into some problems with vaccine persuasion campaigns and reaching a lot of these people in the country. But I think at first he came out of the gate really strong, and I think that the politics of vaccines, at least I think among most Americans, I think that he looked really good. I think at the beginning of the year he looked really good with his going into overdrive here.
Speaking of looking really good, Norm, let me ask you, the Democrats, as of Biden's inauguration in the new Congress, controlled everything: the White House, the Senate, the House of Representatives. How did they use that power in, say, the first 6 or 8 months of the year?
Sure. Before I get to that, Rob, let me just follow on a little bit with what Elaine said. Our politics are tribalized. Democrats and Republicans view each other not as adversaries, but as enemies. And COVID has been tribalized. So what we've seen with vaccines is that it's become a tribal element. For the vaccination rates among Democrats and independents are high. They're lower among Republicans. The rates of contracting COVID and the deaths are dramatically higher in red areas, those that voted for Trump, than they are in blue areas. And that's been one of the great challenges, and it's a challenge clearly for Joe Biden. He did start out with control of both houses of Congress, but keep in mind that the margins were as slim as we can imagine or as they have ever been. A 50-50 Senate with Republicans dead set against almost everything that the president wanted to do. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, said he was 100% behind blocking every element of the Biden program. A House of Representatives where you could lose only 3 Democrats without getting any Republicans. But he started out, as Elaine said, strongly because he got an almost $2 trillion package to deal with the pandemic, but also with the economic turmoil and difficulties that had been framed by the last 2 years, called the American Rescue Plan. And it included some dramatic changes in social policy, including tax credits for children that reduced child poverty by half over the course of the year. It was a great and dramatic start, which he could only do because of a procedure in the law called reconciliation, where you can overcome a Senate filibuster, where the burden is on getting 60, not 50 of the 100 senators, and do it with just 50. And he did it with just his 50 Democrats. But after that, it got a little more rocky.
So generally, I think it's fair to say the first 6, 8 months of the year were good news for the Biden administration. Then came late summer and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which triggered not just a foreign policy crisis, but what seemed to be the blues for the Biden administration. Elaine, what happened and why the change on so many different fronts late summer and autumn?
It was really striking, that change. So going into the summer, I mean, Biden had pushed back the date to pull back troops. I believe it was supposed to have been in May to pull American troops out of Afghanistan. He pushed it back. He sort of said, he and the intelligence community, Biden officials, had sort of framed the withdrawal in a rosy way, as though, you know, it's not a guarantee that the Afghan government will fall, that the Taliban will take over. The Afghan government is strong, they insisted. And when the withdrawal happened, obviously we saw that was not the case. The Taliban quickly took down the Afghan government. And I think that I'm not sure that that is the particular fault of the Biden administration. I think it would be hard to argue that outcome would have happened, you know, under a different president.
Norm, Elaine, you have set us up to take a look at the year of 2022 expertly so many other issues on the agenda for 2021 that we didn't get a chance to get to. If 2020 was a year of protests, 2021 was a year in the courts, and important issues, of course, in the Supreme Court. But we're going to have a lot of time in 2022 to look at all these things and to answer the questions Norm just raised. I want to thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Norm, for helping us take a look back at the year that was.
Thank you, Rob.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rob.
History books may not describe it this way, but 2021, the year now ending, was one of the most consequential we Americans ever experienced. It seems a lifetime ago, but the year began with the transition that wasn't. For the first time ever, the major party candidate who lost the presidential election refused to recognize the victory of the winner, leading instead a national effort to convince, cajole, even intimidate local election officials to call for recounts, while working to convince, cajole, even intimidate members of Congress not to perform their constitutional duty to certify the election. The campaign to stop the steal, as it was dubbed, morphed from political theatrics to deadly rebellion with the terrible, tragic events of January 6th, when rebels invaded the Great Dome structure on Capitol Hill, wreaking the most havoc on a citadel of our democracy since the British burned the White House during the War of 1812. It was a dark day for America when we looked to the world nothing like the country that boasts the world's longest period of uninterrupted democratic government in history. Thankfully, our republic survived, and the transition from president to president occurred on schedule without further incident. After holding their breath for what seemed like an eternity for a large swath of Americans, definitely for Biden voters, but even for some who weren't, the coming of the new administration was a moment to exhale. And that was all in the first month of the year. The next 11 months had a lot of news, from Congress to the courts to Afghanistan. But the biggest story was a major breakthrough in the contest between man and nature, the development and distribution in record time of vaccines against COVID-19. Already, we have gone through multiple variants of the virus, as well as 2 waves of vaccines, the original shots and the booster. Thanks to the wonders of science, we have the tools to protect humanity from the most lethal aspects of this terrible killer. Now it is up to individual Americans and others around the world to decide whether to act on that science. If they do, we have a chance to lead something resembling a normal life. If they don't, our masked, distant existence may be with us for a long, long time. What connects these 2 stories, the January insurrection and the debate over vaccines? The answer, an attack on truth. I don't begrudge President Trump his chance to win re-election, despite the excesses of the 4 years he already served. And I don't begrudge skeptics the right to be convinced about the efficacy and safety of vaccines. But at some point, enough is enough. Votes are counted. Winners are declared. People need to get their shots to protect themselves and, more importantly, everyone else. Will 2022 be a throwback to the time when we just argued over policy, not over whether such fundamentals as what is true and what is merely fiction? I certainly hope so. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول التداعيات السياسية للانتخابات التشريعية في نوفمبر، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.